design of the ballpark really came out of my youth. I say oftentimes that it was the one good idea that I had ever had was the traditional old-fashioned ballpark. I was tired of the concrete donuts that were built in the late 60s and the early 70s. And I thought that a ballpark that had some of the virtues of an old-fashioned ballpark would be very well received. And I was right. When we went public with the idea of a baseball-only facility, uh, the press loved it, and I'm not sure about the politicians, but the press loved it, and it came in part out of my youth. I had seen the movement from Forbes Field, which was a traditional baseball ballpark, irregular in its dimensions, etc., to the concrete donut that was Three Rivers Stadium. It looked like every other ballpark in America, every other stadium in America, and so that's the origin of the idea. But we were influenced certainly by Fenway Park, by Ebbets Field, by other charming. I remember saying to Ed Williams at one point, let's look at the most stable and prosperous baseball teams. The Yankees, the Cubs, the Dodgers, Detroit was at that time. And we said, what do they have in common? They all play in a baseball-only facility. So let's build a baseball-only facility for us. The Colts are gone, and we don't have to make that compromise because who knows if there will be another football team in Baltimore. So we got away from the compromises that were necessary, and we built a traditional old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities and lots of irregularities.
There were, I think, 6 companies that were actively interested in the project, and the one that we selected and that got the contract was HOK, which was out of Kansas City, because they were a sports design architects. We had to award the contract to the lowest competitive bidder. And meanwhile, Larry Lucchino thought that that he was going to get what he called a cookie cutter stadium design from these people, and we selected him, and it turned out that they did a tremendous job for the Orioles and for the Stadium Authority.
I mean, you have to remember the ballpark built right before Camden Yards, designed by HOK, was concrete, the White Sox ballpark. And I've been there, and it's awful, especially now when you see what was able to be done a short time after that opened, and Camden Yards opens. It's night and day. And that's what HOK proposed at first. And I don't know if you've ever heard the story about there used to be a car called a Yugo.
It was built in Yugoslavia when Yugoslavia was still under the Soviet Union. And I'm dating myself, you guys have to look this up. And it was literally their parts of the car was built out of cardboard. It was a very cheap car. They actually tried to sell it in the United States, and it was selling for like $1,200, $1,500, $1,800 at a time when a normal car would cost $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. Remember at the time. So it was famous for breaking down terribly. So it's the epitome of the cheapest, least reliable car you can think. And from a design standpoint, it looked horrible. I mean, it was just like, are you kidding me?
Larry is meeting with the Stadium Authority, and the authority had ultimate decision-making power. They were considering doing something less than what they did at Camden Yards. So he sent somebody in his staff to a Yugo dealership. Where the heck there was a Yugo dealership, I don't know. They brought brochures back for Yugos. And they had a meeting sitting around a conference table, and Larry put a Yugo brochure at everybody's table, a seat. And when they started the meeting, he says, you got Yugo brochures at your seat. None of us drive Yugos, and none of us are going to play ball in a Yugo. He said, we're going to build a real ballpark. And they did. I mean, he would find people who would call it a stadium. It's not a stadium. Football is played in a stadium. Baseball is played in a ballpark.
We didn't plan to ignite a fire. We planned on just building a nice little ballpark for Baltimore. I remember saying that when the Sports Illustrated article came out, comparing our ballpark with the one that was being built simultaneously, which was in Toronto. And I said to my friend Paul Beeston, who was the CEO of the Toronto Blue Jays, I said, Paul, you're trying to build the eighth wonder of the world. You have a hotel in that. You have everything. We're just trying to build a nice little ballpark. The title of the article was A Nice Little Ballpark. And I think that's what we succeeded in building in Baltimore.
It was different because you had a client that wanted to do something special, and you had an architectural firm that listened.
I would tell future clients, most important decision is the site. Well, most important decision is pick us. The second most important decision is the site, because everything we're going to do for you, you're going to be involved, but everything we're going to do for you is going to be about that site, about your community. It has to be, otherwise it could be a McDonald's franchise somewhere.
People look at the warehouse and they think it was always to be part of the stadium, and this thing called the Eutaw Street Corridor was always to be part of the stadium. But that's just not true. It was never envisioned as part of the stadium. It wasn't even in my original budget. The warehouse was to be knocked down, and it was a rat-infested, derelict building that had no particular purpose or recourse.
There was the whole issue of the warehouse itself. And this is where the power of William Donald Schaefer came in. It wasn't, the Stadium Authority didn't have ownership of the warehouse. A friend and political ally of William Donald Schaefer had partial ownership, but ultimately he persuaded them to sell.
It was a mess. You know, that's the nicest thing I could say about it. It had been an abandoned building, broken glass all over the place. The windows were all busted. There was pigeons living in there. There was bird poop everywhere. The horse stuff on the south end. The roof leaked. The elevators were non-functioning. I mean, there wasn't one thing that was right with that building other than the fact that it had potential.
We realized that the warehouse was a unique icon and that it was identifiable. It would lend a certain amount of scale and timelessness to the project. So we had suggested that the warehouse remain.
It's just a classic, and it created an environment. It was a natural. I said, it's perfect. It will give the side to the ballpark and, you know, everything. The batters will try to hit it, you know, on and on. And I was right.
It seemed antithetical to the notion that we were going to create an old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities in downtown Baltimore and tear out the very context that could give us a rationale to follow their lead and have an asymmetrical playing field, asymmetrical heights to the field walls, and unique features that would define Camden Yards. I don't know that there was anyone in our core team, including the Stadium Authority, HOK Sport, who weren't in favor of saving the warehouse, but the Stadium Authority was very clear that it needed to be a financially responsible decision, not just one born out of passion or aesthetics or good urban design.
And I said, let's do another budget estimate. We're 32 million over budget. So I said, oh my God. There was no way that we could build a great ballpark without that 30 or 32 million. So Herb and I went to see Governor Schaefer. I only met him once before. He had approved me to get hired, and it was 5 minutes. So this time, we walked into his office, and he was sitting in a big chair, big tall back on it. And he said, the governor said, gentlemen, nice to see you. What's going on? Herb said, you tell him, Bruce. So I about slithered out of my chair, but I said, Governor, if we're going to build the building that you want, we're 30 million over budget. And I said, I don't think we can do it unless we get the money. So he was in that big chair, and the chair rocked back. He was looking right at the ceiling. I couldn't see his face. And he rocked forward, and he was as red as he could be. He said something about, I'll get you the money, but don't you dare come back and get out of here. That's what he said to us. So Herb and I picked up and ran. That was Thursday or Friday. On Monday, we'd heard that he'd got money for us. We were all set. So I cranked the team up, and we got rolling with that design.
The authorization and funding and land acquisition sort of was the canvas, but the painting was yet to be painted. And it's Janet and Larry Lucchino and Joe Spear and HOK and all the folks at the MSA.
MSA had agreed with the Orioles that they would have design direction control. And so that then turned into a series of sessions to understand what the Orioles wanted and what would fit the MSA's budget.
When I got there, there was no design, no plan on how it was going to get built. And I panicked a little. I said, what the hell? I knew the end date. So I said, we cannot just keep master plan. We got to get going. So we did the selection of the construction manager, and I asked them, what do you think of this schedule? And they said, doable but aggressive. That's what the words were. I can remember Bob Wyatt telling me right off the bat, doable but aggressive.
I mean, executing a renewal project like that, relocating everyone, and doing it without too much political difficulty is a miracle. It is a miracle, and all that just happened to fall into place.
There was conversation about making the wall of the warehouse be the outfield wall. And we didn't like that idea. The Utah Corridor was a street. There was a ton of city utilities in under that street that would have had to have been relocated at a huge cost. So it was pretty clear that Utah Corridor was going to stay.
Utah Street is a prime example of how this fluid dynamics works to move people from a very unusual entry from downtown Baltimore. I mean, all other ballparks you enter primarily from behind home plate and you're close to your seats. Well, in Baltimore, we had to get people from center field around to their seats. Well, Utah Street helped us do that.
It was traditional to come into a baseball park from behind home plate and then spread out. And that was considered the more logical entry point. But once you position Camden Yards so that the third baseline is due north, getting the preferred sun condition on the playing field, it means home plate is the furthest away from the light rail, the existing parking garages, the waterfront promenade at the Inner Harbor, all the things that we wanted to be anchored to. So the idea of Utah Street was really thought of as a way of turning lemons into lemonade.
The original design would have required 4 levels above ground. It wouldn't have merged into the downtown. It would just have been a taller building. They ended up doing is, first of all, and this was at the time, Eli Jacobs owned the Orioles, but at the time, we ended up excavating downward.
One of the biggest fights was over steel versus brick. Steel is quicker, better, faster, cheaper. Brick is expensive and time consuming. But in Janet's mind and Larry's mind, if you're going to have a throwback stadium, it had to be a brick facade. Yes, you could have structural steel, because that too is a throwback, but you couldn't have all steel, and you certainly didn't want concrete. And you wanted to have something that was part of the organic environment, which brick is part of the organic environment. And Janet fought very, very hard for that, incredibly hard for that.
There was a lot of debate and delay over the choice of using steel trusses rather than concrete. And again, that was something that I don't think anyone disputed, that the steel trusses were a more aesthetically pleasing, more architectural feature more in line with the old ballparks, but there was a question about the cost. And we all brought different consultants to the table, and when we were able to prove to ourselves that the steel was not only less expensive, but would be quicker and easier to erect because we didn't have to wait for the temperature to be at the right place and all that kind of good stuff during the winter, that too became a unanimous decision, and one that I think we're all very proud of.
We designed everything with the exception of the actual architectural stuff. Back of the scoreboard with the big Coca-Cola bottle and the clock on the top and the birds that turn. Weather vanes on top of the scoreboard where there was a major question as to whether that was appropriate. And I'll tell you, after opening day, there was no question that it was appropriate because the camera people honed in on it, and it's just like every time they'd go to a break, they'd have a picture of the bird.
I'm often pleased beyond words, really, that some of the traditions that we started, such as this idea of putting the home run balls on Utah Street, have been carried for this long. The idea of the Orioles Hall of Fame plaques being on Utah Street in a public place where you could see them 365 days a year.
She gave life to the concepts that we were talking about at the time in terms of traditional old-fashioned ballpark. She gave us the stanchions at the end of the row from the 1890s, and the whole place took on a traditional and historic vibe.
One of my favorite pieces was that we brought the foul pole from Memorial Stadium and the welcome home sign from Memorial Stadium to Camden Yards. But that was an idea that that came from watching a game with Roland Heeman the last month of the season on 33rd Street. Like, oh, we're gonna miss this place, and maybe we should take a few things with us.
I think one of the significant things that I did that has been repeated on other parks by them stole my idea was the retired numbers. Most of the time they're just stuck up on a plaque somewhere. I said, let's make them into sculpture. And I did a little model. I said, people will come to there and they will have their pictures taken in front of them all the time. I don't know if you've been there recently, but there's always somebody taking pictures in front of those things. Always somebody is taking pictures in front of those things. It's just wonderful.
You look at Ebbets, Shibe, Fenway, Wrigley. They were good urban buildings. They followed the rules of a good urban building, of a street wall sitting parallel to the sidewalk, of activity on the street, not just closing their doors and being dead to the world when there wasn't a baseball game. It's intentionally not a standout building. It's intentionally trying to marry itself into the community so that it feels one with Ridgely's Delight, one with downtown, one with the warehouse, that it's not a standout look at me building. It's I'm part of the family.